What happened to Fort Sedgwick from the film Dances with Wolves, and what does it have to do with the town of Julesburg in Colorado? Sedgwick was a real historical frontier fort, found abandoned by the fictional Lieutenant John Dunbar in the 1988 novel and its 1990 film adaptation. Early in the story, the lieutenant is granted, at his own request, assignment to the American frontier. He goes to Fort Hays in Kansas, where he receives orders to report to Fort Sedgwick in Colorado, at the furthermost outpost of the realm. In Fort Hays, he picks up a guide to lead him to his new post. A journey of about 2 weeks by wagon. And when they get there, Fort Sedgwick is a dusty, abandoned ruin. So what happened to it? The novel, and a deleted scene from the film, shows Captain Cargill and his last soldiers abandon the fort after enduring months of Indian attacks, desertions, and lack of supply from Fort Hays. But Fort Sedgwick's real history is more complicated than that, so let's take a look. And by the way, try not to confuse the frontier Fort Sedgwick in Colorado with the Civil War Fort Sedgwick, also known as Fort Hell, near Petersburg, Virginia. And don't ask me how long I was confused, okay? Thank you. In 1856, U.S. Army Lieutenant Francis Bryan found a Native American trail on the south side of the South Platte River with a crossing near present-day Julesburg. The Army began using the route, and in the aftermath of the Colorado Gold Rush of 1859, it became part of the Overland Trail, a busy way station for westward-bound emigrants. Around 1858, a half-French-Canadian, half-Indian trapper named Jules Benny established a small trading post and saloon along the upper crossing. The town became known as Julesburg after its proprietor. Although the increased traffic on the trails was good for the settlement, it angered the Plains Indians, who had signed treaties, which were being ignored, with the federal government. Tensions erupted into the Colorado War, fought from 1863 to 1865 between the Cheyenne and Arapaho nations and white settlers and soldiers. To protect the stage lines, emigrants, and the overland route to Denver, Camp Rankin, Fort Sedgwick, was established near Julesburg in 1864. The troops at this fort were ordered to protect communications and trade routes while on the lookout for hostile Indians. Originally called Camp Rankin, the post was located opposite the mouth of Lodgepole Creek, about 5 miles from the present-day town of Julesburg, Colorado. Tensions erupted into an all-out war after U.S. troops, under Colonel John Chivington, slaughtered more than 150 peaceful Cheyenne and Arapaho Indians in the Sand Creek Massacre on November 29, 1864. As the victors paraded in triumph through the streets of Denver and exhibited 100 scalps on the stage of a theater, the Cheyenne survivors of Sand Creek spread word of the massacre across the plains. In a great council near the head of the Republican River, Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Sioux chiefs smote the war pipe. For more than a month, in January and February 1865, the Indians ravaged the South Platte Valley, killing 50 whites. Burning stage stations and ranches, destroying telegraph lines, twice sacking the hamlet of Julesburg, Colorado, and even attacking nearby Fort Rankin. The two websites previously quoted provide more details on what happened. On January 7, 1865, 1,000 Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Sioux warriors attacked the weakly garrisoned post and killed 14 soldiers and 4 civilians. When the Indians failed to take the fort, they raided the town of Julesburg. The Indians raced up the Platte River to the undefended settlement, where they looted the stage station, store, and warehouse, carrying away a large amount of plunder. A few weeks later, in February, the Indians again attacked Julesburg and its few citizens, who fled to Fort Sedgwick and watched as their town was pillaged and burned to the ground. The small military force at Fort Sedgwick was unable to prevent the burning of Julesburg and the loss of lives for the 18 defenders. Before long, Julesburg residents staked out a new town 3 miles east, just outside the Fort Sedgwick military reservation boundary. The growing town was later described by General James Russling in his 1874 book, Across America, the Great West and Pacific Coast. The town of Julesburg consisted of a blacksmith shop, a grocery, a billiard saloon, and a half-dozen houses, all of adobe. It was on the South Platte River, at the point of crossing for the Utah and Montana travel, and so did a considerable business already in canned fruits and Tanglefoot whiskey. It was a pretty busy stage station until the Union Pacific Railroad rails arrived north of the river. A third Julesburg was founded when the end of the railroad track was moved several miles east. Saloons, gambling houses, and prostitution parlors did a thriving business as the population grew to nearly 3,000. In the meantime, the military post of Camp Rankin was enlarged to make space for additional buildings and tents, and renamed to Fort Sedgwick, in honor of General John Sedwick, who was killed during the American Civil War. Also known as the War of Northern Aggression for any Southern viewers here. For the next several years, the troops protected the overland trail, and the meadows surrounding the post became a favorite emigrant campground area. During the construction of the Union Pacific Railroad across western Nebraska in 1867, troops from the post protected the construction workers from the constant threat of Indian attack. In the meantime, the U.S. Army defeated Cheyenne leader Tall Bull's Dog Soldiers at the Battle of Summit Springs in 1869, marking the end of Native American resistance on the Colorado Plains. Fort Sedgwick declined in importance, and by 1870 just 2 barracks remained. The Army decommissioned Fort Sedgwick in 1871. The buildings were dismantled, and the soldiers in its cemetery reburied at Fort McPherson National Cemetery in Nebraska. Now we know the fort was empty because it was abandoned after it was no longer useful. But that does not explain why, in the fictional story Dances with Wolves, the lieutenant could not figure out what happened. The only 2 men who knew about his presence there were taken out of the story, one by his own hand, and the other by hostile Native Americans. But he was only 5 miles from the busy town of Julesburg, which he should have known about ahead of time. If he had looked at a map, he could have at least gone there to buy more pants. And according to the book, he should have stumbled onto it. He loved the daily reconnaissance rides on Cisco's back. Each day they rode out in a different direction, sometimes as far as 5 or 6 miles from the fort. Even the nearest group of Native Americans did not know why he was there alone. But that's okay. His isolation adds tension to the adventure story. That still leaves the problem of the broken timeline between the fictional story and the fort's real history, which we will address in another video. Nothing remains of the old fort today. The site is designated by a marker, but all that's left is a field. The original flagpole from Fort Sedgwick was moved and is now in front of the Sedgwick County Courthouse. Plans and efforts are being made to rebuild a replica of Fort Sedgwick. The committee is in the fundraising stage of this project. Meanwhile, the town of Julesburg is still going strong. You can visit the Fort Sedgwick Museum and Depot Museum, which, according to their website, honors and shares the history of Fort Sedgwick and the entire county. Artifacts and memorabilia from the Union Pacific Railroad, Pony Express, Native Americans, and early pioneers are on display. Thank you for watching. Please like this video, subscribe to this channel for new videos every week or two, and see the description below for a list of books, films, and online resources featured in this video.